Well, good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you here to Catholic Park Trail College. I'm Dr. Michael Eamon. I'm the principal here at Catholic Park Trail College, and it's a wonderful evening for sure. Don't let the looks fool you. Although we're all business on the top, it's all winter down below. We have lots of boots on, and a special thank you to everyone who is here tonight. We have actually a pretty full Bagnani Hall who braved the snow to come out for our Trent at North talk. Before I begin, I just want to welcome you to the college. This is a very special place. This is where Trent University began 59 years ago. And in fact, today, in 1964, Tom Simons issued a press release. And the press release said, this fall, guess what's going to happen? Something called Peter Robinson College and Trail College. So the official announcement of Trail College is today. So we're celebrating the 69th anniversary, sorry, 59th, 49th, what are we? No, 59th anniversary, let's hear it, thank you for that. 59th anniversary of the announcement of Trail College. I'm a historian, by the way. Just wanted to get that out. What's so special about Trail is that our location, our age, but also our location in downtown Peterborough. And I'm very grateful that you're all here today, and grateful that you're here online. But I'm also very grateful that we're here on the treaty and traditional territory of the Jeannette Menzies. And for time out of memory, the Anishinaabe and their ancestors traversed the space. And it is a very special space because from Chemong Lake all the way down to Little Lake in downtown Peterborough, there is a Grand Portage. And this Grand Portage was a space for the exchange of ideas, of conversations and communications, of commodities. It was a space of movement, and has been a space of movement for the Anishinaabe for, as I said, time out of memory. So I'm very grateful for the teachings of the Anishinaabe, and grateful that we can honor this space by maintaining, preserving, and amplifying it as a space of debate, exchange, and discussion. So I thank you all for being here, and I'm grateful to be on the territory. Well, we have a big road of great named speakers today, and the first I am to tag this off to our Tier 1 Canada Research Chair of the North, Dr. Whitney Lachenbauer. So please put your hands together for him.
Well, thanks Michael, thanks everybody for being here. Canadian Studies began at Trent in 1972, and since that time it's become one of the most important and respected Canadian Studies programs in Canada. Trent was actually home to the first Canadian Studies department in the country. We maintain that tradition through excellence in teaching, as well as innovative curriculum that explores the question of Canada. And we really continue to be on the leading edge of thinking, writing, and teaching about Canada, our history, governance, and society. And our faculty are well published, well known in their respective fields, and contribute both to the life of the university and to our undergraduate students and graduate students. And we engage with our students in a broad and interdisciplinary curriculum with a strong focus on events of significance at the personal, community, and the national level. And their interest takes many shapes and forms, but it begins with a focus on knowing ourselves and understanding our relationship with the place in which we live. And Michael, I think, thank you for that introduction to connect us to this very special place. And we explore new challenges that face Canadians and affect life in Canada, including reconciliation, climate change, politics, equity, and social justice, and as we're going to hear about tonight, Canada as an Arctic and indeed a circumpolar nation. And in keeping with this mission, this speaker series, called Conversations in Honor of Tom Simons, brings together distinguished Canadians with a strong record of public service to Trent to share their insights and their experiences. And it's keeping with the vision of our founding president, Tom Simons, whose vision was always to know ourselves. And this conversation series reflects a commitment to continuing this tradition of self-reflection. This fall, we had Thompson Highway, who came in and joined us. And in 2023, it will include Senator Donna Dasko and Dr. Beverly Baines. Tonight, we have with us Canada's ambassador to Iceland, a great friend and wonderful ambassador for Trent University, as well as for Canada, Jeannette Menzies. And her talk is also part of the North at Trent lecture series, which is dedicated to profiling ideas by leading thinkers and practitioners about northern issues. And here to introduce her is actually another former Icelandic ambassador and Trent graduate, Stuart Wheeler. So before I can turn over to Stuart, I have to give a bit of background. Stuart graduated from Trent with an honors BA in international studies before doing a year abroad in Universidad de Granada in Spain. In 1993, began his career in the public service, working in the Public Information Office at the House of Commons. And then the next year, joined External Affairs and International Trade Canada. He served abroad in Washington, as Second Secretary covering congressional relations, energy trade policy in Bogota and Colombia as a political counselor, London as head of the public affairs team at the High Commission, in Kabul. I could go on and on and on, and it would be worth it, believe me. He's also served as the press secretary to the Governor General of Canada, Adrienne Clarkson, when she was in that role, and in that capacity accompanied her on her state visit to Iceland in 2003. So foreshadowing tonight, of course. He was Ambassador of Canada in Iceland from 2012 to 2016, then went on to serve in the Ontario Public Service as the Assistant Deputy Minister, International Relations, and Chief of Protocol in the Cabinet Office. And then, 2019, Stuart Wheeler was appointed Chief of Protocol of Canada. And he's received a wealth of very well-earned accolades, Minister's Award for Foreign Policy Excellence for his work on the Kosovo Task Force, Queen Elizabeth II Gold Jubilee Medal in 2002, and an Operational Service Medal, Southwest Asia Ribbon for his civilian service in Afghanistan. So, Mr. Wheeler, an honor to welcome you, to in turn welcome our speaker for tonight.
Wow, that's an energy level I'm not sure I can live up to. Good evening. Thank you very much for that. It is great to be back at Trent. I should actually start also by thanking Trent University, obviously the School of Canadian Studies, Heather Nicol, for inviting me and my partner Brian back for the second time to be part of the North at Trent series. When I was Ambassador of Canada to Iceland a few years ago, Brian and I were invited to come and give talks as part of this series. Me in a similar talk to Jeanette's this evening. We'll have to compare notes afterwards. But more interestingly, Brian to present a collection of slides that his father had taken and self-taught development of photography when he was an RCMP officer stationed in the high Arctic at an outpost for 3 years back in the 1950s, which he has donated the entire collection to Trent's library for the Arctic collection. And that was actually the first time, the second time I met Whitney, because Whitney also is a very well-known face at Global Affairs, or Department of Foreign Affairs at the time, and has often been invited to Ottawa to teach our Arctic 101 course for diplomats that are going anywhere to serve in the Arctic, or anywhere to serve around the world where they'll be working on issues related to the Arctic. So it's great to see you again, and to know that you have made the move and brought your Canada chair to Trent. So thank you for that. Let me just say, it's great to be back. Let's hope this becomes a pattern, and the Canadian ambassadors to Iceland continue to be invited to speak in this series. But more importantly, the Canadian ambassadors to Iceland continue to be Trent graduates. When introducing someone, one could be tempted, as Whitney did very, very well, to read their biography, but I'm not going to do that, since I think there was a very good summary of the biography in the material for tonight. But looking at that biography and the summary on the Trent's announcement page, people might come to the conclusion, the logical conclusion, that Jeannette Menzies is perfectly suited to be Canada's ambassador to the Republic of Iceland. First, of course, if you read her bio, is her excellent education, an MA from Trent in Canadian Heritage and Development Studies, and not just because it's a relevant advanced degree, not just because we're at Trent and we're obviously biased, but when I think about life in Iceland, there is much about studying at Trent that I think prepares one to thrive. It's a small country by population, with lots of open space, beautiful surroundings, an independent-minded people who like to speak their minds. Sound familiar? When I was studying back in the late 80s, early 90s, when Whitney was still in high school, there was a beautiful poster of campus, which it captured the stunning beauty of the place. And I can't remember exactly what the tagline was or what it said, but the tagline basically left you with the idea, the understanding that the quality of the Trent educational experience was formed by the quality of the human environment in which you learned, as much as by the physical environment in which you lived. And I really believe that's true. And I think that says something too about the way people come out of this place and interact with the world. And I think it certainly stood me in good stead in Iceland, and I'm sure, as I've seen Jeannette on that stage, that it's also coming in handy for her. If people reading her bio had dug a bit deeper, they would have realized that while she was here at Trent, she studied under T.H.B. Simons, who, in his retirement, if one could ever say he was retired, served as her main thesis advisor, which of course would impress any Trent alumni even more. And if they dug even deeper, they'd find that she had done work after graduation once she joined our department with Mary Simon as Circumpolar Ambassador when she returned from serving as Canada's ambassador to Denmark. Of course, Mary Simon, who as Chancellor had only recently presented Jeannette with her degree at convocation. And all of those things, of course, which come in very handy last fall when one Mary Simon traveled to Iceland on a working visit as Governor General of Canada to deliver a keynote speech at one of the world's foremost Arctic conferences on her very first trip to a country outside of Canada that is in the Arctic. And I'd say you know you have a very well prepared ambassador when you find out that she's on first name basis with Tom Simons. That sort of kills it right there. But when the first thing the Governor General does when touching down in Reykjavik, before she shakes hands with the Chief of Protocol of Iceland, is to give the Ambassador of Canada a bear hug that's clearly destined for a long-time friend. If you keep reading her bio, people might find it interesting that she's had over 20 years experience as a diplomat with Global Affairs Canada and its predecessor. We went through many names over the years: External Affairs, Foreign Affairs, International Trade, Foreign Affairs, Development, International Trade, and Foreign Affairs. We were split for a while, and of course we came back as Foreign Affairs, International Trade. And then finally Global Affairs. So she is, through all of that, a seasoned diplomat, which is of course essential training for talented ambassadors. And when you look at that experience inside our department, you also see that she spent time in Consular Affairs and Emergency Management branch of our department, which I have to tell you is hugely important in a place like Iceland. Most people go to Iceland and hope that they might have a chance to see a volcano. When you're the ambassador and you're preparing to go, you get to dream even bigger. You might actually see one erupt. Because if you're going to live in Iceland for 4 years, then it's not if a volcano will erupt while you're there, it's when will the volcano erupt while you're living there, and how close will it be to citizens and infrastructure and your office, and so I'm sure when last year or the year before, when the latest fissure erupted, and they were having 500 to 1,000 small tremors a day in the Reykjavik area. Her emergency management training was kind of coming back in the back of her mind. You might also note that she's had multiple Arctic-related roles at Global Affairs, including a posting in Oslo, leading Canada's International Centre for the Arctic, which brought her to Iceland on numerous occasions. We were very lucky to host her and to travel the north with her. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that from Jeannette shortly. Her bio also includes the years that she spent as a director at Polar Knowledge Canada, in charge of international partnerships for the Canadian High Arctic Research Station in Nunavut, And if people, again, did their homework, they might find out that one of those international partnerships that she established then was with the Icelandic Arctic Cooperation Network, giving her a built-in network in one of the key areas of our bilateral relationship before she even arrived in the country. So there you go. With just those elements, you might think that she was already the most qualified person possible to take on this leadership role at a Canadian embassy in the capital of an Arctic Council member state. And all of that is true, to be sure. But in my mind, those elements actually pale in comparison to two lesser-known facts about Jeannette. And they're not in her bio, but they are hands down part of what contributes to her great success. The first is actually related to her first overseas posting as a diplomat. She was preparing to be sent to Ankara, Turkey. In fact, it's something she did while she was in the lead-up, and this might have said something about her future aspirations, but while other diplomats in her position might have been intensely studying Turkish language, which is fairly complicated, Turkish geopolitics, the history of the Ottoman Empire. I mean, there are lots of things one could do when one is preparing to move to Turkey. Instead, she took a different path, and instead of that intensive Turkish prep, she took 3 weeks off, put her bicycle on an airplane, and went to Iceland to cycle 1,500 kilometers around the ring road that circumnavigates the entire island. So she's visited every major stop around the island 20 years ago. As far as I understand, the 3 coldest, wettest weeks of her life. But, you know, no other ambassador to Iceland has ever done that. Like, talk about preparing to be welcomed into the hearts of every Icelander as soon as you arrive back. But in fact, it's the second and really the most important reason why I think she hands down is the best ambassador we could have there. And it goes way back earlier than her time at Trent. And to understand that, I need to tell you a little thing about Iceland and its connection to Canada. When my appointment to Iceland was announced, I had many people ask me if I planned in my preparations to travel to Manitoba, or more specifically to Gimli, before I left for Iceland. And I kind of answered, no, I'm not planning to go on a fact-finding trip to Gimli before I move to Iceland, but I sort of asked why I should be considering that. And they all said, well, no, I think you should go and you should meet the people in Gimli, because when you get to Iceland, you've got to be ready for the fact that when Icelanders find out that you're from Canada, they will ask you if you know their cousin in Gimli. I mean, I knew that Manitoba was the home to many Icelandic Canadians. I think that's, maybe Canadians might know that. Certainly, preparing to go to Iceland, I knew something about that, and maybe somewhere in the recesses of my mind from some history book, I knew that Gimli might have been the place where their first settlement was. But I did find it hard to believe that every Icelander would have a cousin there, or even more so would ask me if I knew them. Clearly, in my mind, an urban myth. I was wrong. Everyone in Iceland, indeed, has a cousin that spent some time in Manitoba and probably in Gimli. And many of them know of specific cousins that live near or there, or near there, that they may never have met, but whom they dream of meeting. They know the names of all of their ancestors that lead back to their common ancestor that left Iceland 150 years ago. Icelanders are very good at knowing all of their relatives. I think it's to six steps out. And actually, that's an interesting master's thesis someday on what do countries do when they don't have a social safety net? How do they make other people responsible for community? Anyway, I digress. So the people in so it does actually happen that people tell you about their cousins in Gimli, And some, in fact, ask if you've been there, probably hoping that you'll say yes so that they can ask you if you know their cousin. And the reason's fairly simple. During the period from 1875 to 1905, fully 1/3 of Iceland's entire population, of 90,000 people at the time, emigrated to North America. And they all, virtually all, moved first to Gimli. From there, spread out across North America. They're a very successful group of hardy immigrants. So much so that today their descendants number approximately 250,000 Icelandic Canadians, and almost half of those in Manitoba. And when you consider that there's only 350,000 Icelanders at all in all of Iceland, it then becomes a little easier to understand how the Canadian diaspora and a place like Gimli would be so ever present in their minds. In fact, in the Icelandic language, there is a special word for Icelandic Canadians. They're just called Western Icelanders. They're not even part of a separate society. And I tell you all of this because this is Jeannette's secret weapon. She grew up in Winnipeg with Western Icelandic neighbors and spent summers of her youth in Gimli. This is a golden calling card in Iceland. So she very likely has met their cousins. She most certainly has seen the big parade many times on Icelandingidagurinn, which is the Manitoba Icelandic festival that attracts thousands every summer to the shores of Lake Winnipeg. She has probably heard the Icelandic national anthem and eaten the favorite treats served by Icelandic Canadian grandmothers more than she can remember. With that, and with the ability to tell those stories, she is automatically family in Iceland. And then you add to that the fact that she loves to ski and hike and is learning to speak Icelandic, one of the most difficult languages in Europe. And it's no surprise that Icelanders love her and want to get to know her. And that, my friends, is priceless when you're an ambassador. It opens doors, it helps in turn to position you to advance Canada's agenda on the world stage. So it gives me great pleasure, and it's a tremendous honor as a fellow Trent alum and a fellow Canadian ambassador to Iceland to introduce Jeannette Menzies, the most perfect ambassador to Iceland that Canadians could ever hope for, our country's embedded honorary Western Icelander, all the way from Gimli, now via Reykjavik.
Now, I knew Stuart was a very tough ambassador to follow, and I forgot that he'd also be a very difficult speaker to follow. But I'm very used to following Stuart, so thank you for that, Stuart. And you said a number of things that I had forgotten to include in my notes. So this is a really perfect segue because you provided a lot of that foundation and said some very kind things. So I'm very touched. Thank you for that. Thank you to Heather for inviting me to be here today. It is always a joy for me to be in Peterborough. And we were just discussing that the last time I came to speak, there was also a snowstorm. So anyone on the line that would like a snowstorm, just invite me to speak. And I will organize a snowstorm. Last time I think we rescheduled and then it happened the next week. But anyway, we went ahead with it tonight, and that's appropriate because in Iceland the weather is often like this. And I'm sorry, can everyone hear me clearly? Yeah. So I want to spend a little bit of time sharing some pictures and sharing a little bit about my experience, and I will walk through a little bit of back then and a bit of now, and kind of some of the big lessons I learned along the way, and some of the exciting things that I do in Iceland. Because one question I get from many people, young and old, all age groups, is what exactly does an ambassador do? So I'll give you a little glimpse into a day in the life of an ambassador. And although I won't talk specifically about recruitment to the Foreign Service or the Government of Canada, I always love talking about those things. So that can be a whole separate conversation where people can be welcome to reach out to me if you ever want to apply. So then before I go further, where's Kathy in the room? Kathy's at the back. Kathy, thank you. Kathy's been very helpful, just helping to get me here and out of here again. So thank you, Kathy. Maybe I'll go to slide 1, 2. There we go. All right. So as has been mentioned already, I came to Trent to do my master's degree. I have to tell you why I came to Trent. It's probably maybe obvious. I was walking around the library at University of Manitoba where I did my undergrad, feeling lost because I didn't know what to do my undergrad in, and I was in arts, and I thought, I don't know what I want to do my undergrad in. nothing really called out to me. And then I realized that the curriculum, there were little Canadian flags next to a bunch of courses, and I realized I was drawn to all of those: Canadian art, Canadian politics, Canadian history. And then it dawned on me that I could actually weave those all together to do a degree in Canadian studies. So I kind of found that out a bit of a funny way. And then while I was in the library walking around University of Manitoba, I don't know why, I must have found a section on Canadian studies, and I saw these 2 big volumes of a book called To Know Ourselves. This sounds so cheesy, because it's actually a true story. I pull the volume out and I start flipping through it. And I was like, oh my God, it resonated with me, like it spoke to me. And then I saw an ad that the author, the guy that wrote those books, was coming to the University of Manitoba to speak. And so it was a Saturday morning, and this was at a time when I was maybe going out a little bit more than I do. I remember I was out very late the night before, and I did not want to get up and go, but I was like, no, I'm going to go. I want to go listen to this guy speak. I was so inspired by Professor Simons that I introduced myself after, and then I went home and I wrote him a letter. And I asked him if he would be willing to speak with me to give me advice on how I could make my way to Trent to do Canadian studies. And I joke because usually I think when I was applying and when I came to Trent, there was always 20 people that were accepted at the university, and I think that year there were 21. And he was retired but not retired. He never really did retire, but anyway. So that is why I arrived at Trent. And then of course, not only did I have the wonderful experience of working with Tom Simons, but I had the wonderful experience of working with John Wadland and Julia Harrison, who are both here tonight. And I could not have asked for a more wonderful, wonderful committee. And I didn't know what I was doing, as all of you know. But that's kind of been the common path, is I really didn't know what I was doing, and I just I followed what I was interested in. And it always went in the right direction. So when I look back on that time at Trent, to me, it's about being inspired and following your passion and really like trusting in that, and being inspired by professors that were here. I also rowed while I was here. I learned to juggle staying out late and getting up early for rowing, which was a really important skill set that's helped me later in life. And then I did my master's thesis I'd spent a number of years working out west in a national park, and I did my master's thesis on the history of the internment camps of Ukrainians during World War I in Yoho National Park. And just recently, about half a year ago, someone reached out to me and they saw my thesis title and they wanted to talk to me about my research. And it's amazing, 20 years later, someone's interested in my research. This is the stuff that I realize my work is now inspiring someone else to maybe do something in a similar light. Actually, and I'll say one last thing about that time at Trent, is in every one of my meetings with Tom Simons or with Julia or John, everyone always asked me, so how are you doing? Are you having fun? And that stuck with me. And I just had a meeting with my boss a few weeks ago, and it was a really busy meeting, and we went over like a million things, and at the very end she said to me, one last thing, are you having fun? And it's important to have fun. And you'll see that's a common thread also. Okay, next page. Oh, there we go. All right, so this is me receiving my master's degree from the then Chancellor of Trent University, Mary Simon. I didn't actually realize it was her at the time, but this picture has been sitting on the dresser in one of the guest rooms at my parents' house. And it was many years later that I walked by it, and I was like, wait a second, that's Mary Simon. So that's 25 years ago, that picture. And it's quite interesting how she's kind of been this common person that's kind of kept coming back into my life. And maybe it's the other way around, me into her life, I'm not sure. But I'll go to the next page because I want to just spend a moment talking about mentors. So this more recent picture here is the just after the bear hug that Stuart referred to at the airport in Reykjavik. And then the other picture is at Trent, and I think it was 2018. I think it was during a roundtable that I organized where Tom Simons and Mary Simon brought together a number of thinkers on education in the North to have a discussion around a future university in Canada's Arctic. I have other pictures of Professor Simons, but this was the one that I chose because it's him later in life. And I realized that mentors can come in different forms and they can come at different times. And he was someone who I stayed in touch with from the time I met him in 1995 until he passed away 2 years ago. And I think people like that in your life, even if you lose touch for a while, you can always get in touch with them again. And those kinds of people have been such inspirations to me, and especially him. And the work he's done and the interest he shows in people has been really inspiring. And on that, I'd say John and Julia, I'm having breakfast with them tomorrow, and I'm so excited because I miss having professors to talk to in Peterborough, because I kind of got a little focused on Professor Simon. So he'll be pleased that I'm carrying that on with others as well. And then, of course, Mary Simon, who I met as Chancellor, but then I got to work with her once I joined Foreign Affairs. She was the Circumpolar Ambassador. She was my first boss, technically, at the department. But I didn't really get to know her until a little bit later. But she's also, she's also been someone who I remember talking to her about, do you ever get frustrated about the lack of change on certain issues? And she has an approach that's just so reflective and so, she sees every moment as a teaching moment, and has such a calm patience and a quiet way it's a quiet diplomacy. And I've seen it over many decades, and it's just, the day she was named as the Governor General of Canada was an emotional one for many people. And it meant so much to see her go into that role, and I think it's just such an incredible time for Canada to have her in that position, to be able to see us shift into this new time of reconciliation. I'll go to the next slide. I think that's right. This is where we start talking about fun. Now that road probably wasn't fun. So when I decided to bike around Iceland, I was with a friend. She's still a friend, so that's a good sign. The road was not all paved. It's paved now. But back when I biked around Iceland, it was 2003, and there were approximately 2,000 tourists that visited Iceland at that time. 20 years later, there's now 2.5 million tourists that visit Iceland. So I probably wouldn't do that bike trip again now. There's too many people on the road. But at that time, it was very quiet, and it was difficult. For sure, it was challenging. The wind was something I'd never experienced before. But I did that for a while, and I also worked for a cycling company in France for a while called Backroads. I don't think that's in my bio, but anyway, I loved I loved riding my bike, and I thought, I'm going to ride my bike. That's going to be my job. And then I realized, wait a second, I like riding my bike with myself and with a friend. I don't like riding a bike with 25 people and catering to all their needs. So I moved away from the Backroads, the bike touring thing, and then joined Foreign Affairs. And then I realized that actually leading bike trips is like leading delegations. And Stuart, I think you'll relate to this. You're kind of taking care of all their needs, just not on a bike. They're in motorcades. So I think my point on that is anything you do and everything you do, it probably all can apply and contribute to what you end up doing later. So my next slide is about the north. I just included a few pictures there because I biked around Iceland because I like places that not as many people and that have beautiful landscapes. And at one point when I worked in the consular division, I went on holiday in March to Inuvik, and my colleagues were like, what are you doing? Everyone else is going to Mexico. And I went to Inuvik because I wanted to go to Inuvik. Well, who wouldn't want to go to Inuvik? Like, I've always been drawn to these places where it's just not as busy. Of course, it's getting busier now. The pictures I've included here, the one on the right there is one of the pictures from when I worked at Polar Knowledge Canada, which I'll come back to in a second. But a big piece of what the Government of Canada is focused on is about integrating Indigenous knowledge and having respect for the knowledge that Indigenous people bring that may be different to how we normally view Western science. And so I think that's part of it too, is being so, learning about Northerners has always been really interesting and inspiring to me. The bottom picture is when I was on an expedition with youth, with an organization called Students on Ice. And I believe we were up in the north for maybe it was 2 weeks. And that's the first time I tried seal meat. And so that was something I hadn't done before. And it was kind of different, I have to say. It was it wasn't my favorite food, but I've always tried to embrace the culture that I'm in. And I think as a diplomat, having curiosity has been something that I think you have to be curious to be a diplomat, because otherwise why would you move? Like, Stuart's moved to a whole bunch of places that are quite different, and so you have to have that curiosity to thrive in a new place. The other picture is related to the High Arctic Research Station that I'll come back to. Next picture is a map of the Arctic, I think so that's just a little bit about the Arctic. I won't go through all of it, but it's a little bit about the demographic of the Arctic, the population. The size of Canada's north is the same size of Europe, but with a population that is quite significantly smaller and spread out and not connected by roads, which means different challenges in the north, but also different opportunities. I'll go to the next page. Actually, before I go to the next page, I just want to explain where the High Arctic Research Station is. So I'm going to move away from the microphone. So up there is Victoria Island, is this island here. And then Cambridge Bay is at the bottom of the island. And just for interest's sake, Iceland, the country of Iceland, is half the size of Victoria Island. So that gives you an idea of the scale of Canada's north when you think that Iceland can fit into that island. The Canadian High Arctic Research Station, I'll go to the next page. There we go. My friend here reminded me the last time I spoke here, I spoke about the High Arctic Research Station, so I can maybe share the video from that, because I won't spend the whole time we're talking about that. But the big thing I want to say is that Canada has this absolutely world-class, gorgeous science facility in the north. It is very different from science facilities in other polar regions because it was intentionally built in a community. And when you look at where other polar science research stations are in the world, many of course are in Antarctica, many are in Svalbard. And this one that we have in Canada is right within an Indigenous community. So there's massive opportunity for integrating Indigenous knowledge into Western science and changing how we understand changes going on to the climate, occurring with the climate. And it meant that in setting this up, I was part of the team that was, I always say I helped to build the station. Well, I didn't actually help to build the station, but I helped to build the teams and the organization of how the programs would run. And it was challenging because we were doing that. I was living in Ottawa, going back and forth to Cambridge Bay, trying to create something, but with my Southern Ottawa bureaucratic hat on. And that was difficult because that's not what the North wants. And so we had hired a number of staff and continue to hire many staff and trying to increase the number of Northerners. And so what's really interesting is most of the staff now live and work in Cambridge Bay, which is the right thing to do. Because when you're trying to do things out of Ottawa, it's not always the right way to run a Northern science facility. The next page I will go to, this one is, I wanted to include this just so you can see the beauty of the inside of this facility. There was an art competition to determine what artwork would be included inside the facility, and it's an Inuit art competition, and it resulted in some incredible pieces of artwork that are included on the floors, on the walls, and they have pictures of the art that's actually part of a traveling exhibit that we just had in Iceland, which if any of you were at the Arctic Circle Assembly in October, you might have seen. But it's really, really inspiring. And what I like about the room here, this round one, that's another picture of it, is it was designed with the interests of Northerners in mind, because they were asked what kind of meeting space do they want. They did not want a room like this with a podium at the front and seats. They wanted a round room where everyone would sit equally. And that's what they did in the facility. And what's really wonderful is this facility is working and including, it's connected to other facilities in the north. It's connected to many universities in terms of knowledge exchange, and of course international partnerships too, including with Iceland. I'll go to the next page, which I think talks about foreign affairs. As Stuart mentioned, it underwent many name changes over the years, which you very eloquently tied together in about a minute. That was impressive. I think I was there for most of those changes, but Basically, I wasn't going to share this fact, but if my friend here told me I should share this fact. The first time I applied to Foreign Affairs, I failed. So I'm admitting it here. I decided to share that because it's a really hard exam. It's a really hard exam, and I didn't get through it the first time, and I tried again. I think I tried it the second time after I realized the bike touring thing wasn't really my gig. And the second time I tried for Foreign Affairs and Canadian International Development Agency and the Management Trainee Program. And I thought, okay, hopefully one of these will work out. Well, all three of them worked out. And so I had to choose. Well, how do I choose? So suddenly I had all these choices. And so it's sort of a reminder to just stick with it, because sometimes it takes a few times to get through these things. I'm not sure how many people are listening and how many people know that I failed, but anyway, there it is. In my 22 years, maybe it is, with the Department of Foreign Affairs, I've done a few things, and as Stuart mentioned, the Arctic has drawn me back a number of times. And I worked on consular and emergency management for a while, which was really helpful. When I was posted to Turkey, the government of Canada made the decision to evacuate Canadians out of Lebanon. And so one of the evacuation routes was through Turkey. And for some reason the bike keeps coming up, but I was in France with my bicycle on a bike trip at the time and got a phone call that I had to get back to Turkey to evacuate Canadians. So luckily I can pack the bike up quickly. Off I went back to Turkey. I think I went straight to the south of Turkey with my bicycle, probably didn't have a suit. And I think I was the airport control person. I remember doing announcements in French and English telling people not to push each other getting on the planes. So, you do such a range of different jobs, which is what is the beauty of the job. And one can also go to other parts of the government of Canada, as I did for 4 years to work at Polar Knowledge Canada. In Ankara, Turkey, I actually wasn't even responsible for Turkey. That's the other funny thing. My job was to cover the former Soviet Union, so I traveled to Georgia, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan, and that's where I spent all my time. And I joke with people because I've always been drawn to the Arctic, and somehow I ended up in Ankara, and they were like, how did that happen? And I joke that I thought I was applying for Anchorage. Anyway, I love Turkey, so. All right, next slide. Okay, so Iceland, as you heard, as I was preparing to move to Turkey, instead of studying Turkish, I studied Iceland and rode my bicycle around the island. A few things about Iceland. Stuart has mentioned the population. I think you said 350,000. It's now up to 380,000. Yeah. 14% foreign born. That's a big change. A lot of changing demographics in Iceland. The prime industry was fisheries until 2015, and now it's been surpassed by tourism, which makes sense considering you have 2.5 million tourists. They're expecting 3 million by 2025, so you should get there before 2025. A few of the main, actually I'll start with just a few things that Iceland focuses on when it comes to foreign policy. I'd say the big things are peace and security and doing what they can, doing what their part. They are a small country, small population, but they for sure are, they are very effective, and like for a small country, it's outstanding what the Icelanders can do. When it comes to innovation on climate change technology, they are figuring out ways to turn carbon emissions into stone by pressing them into the rock, and they do some really interesting, innovative ways, of course with renewable energy, and I'll come back to that a bit, but they do have the abundance of volcanoes and hot pools, but they've worked to create the technology to be able to heat homes. 90% of their homes are heated by geothermal energy, and I think it's 30% electricity is from geothermal, so it's pretty impressive. So climate environment is big for Iceland. Gender equality, they rank the most gender equal country in the world, I think for the 14th year in a row. And I mentioned innovation. All right, so next page. I'm gonna just say something about that picture. That picture is looking from the residence where I live, looking out the window. Across the street is the president's office, President of Iceland. President of Iceland is an elected position. And the current president, he's in his second term, and he happens to be married to a lovely Canadian who is a friend of both Stuart and mine. And she's written a wonderful book called Secrets of the Sprakkar, which is all about her perspectives on gender equality in Iceland, and it's an amazing read. This picture I took the day I arrived in Iceland, and I sat there in an empty house. The furniture hadn't arrived yet, and but that little flag was there, sitting in the window. Actually, that's the only thing that was in the house, was that flag. But it reminded me of Winnipeg, because when I played, at my neighbor's house down the street, there was always a little Icelandic flag, and so I kind of sat there in this empty house, and I felt at home, because that flag was familiar to me alongside the Canadian flag. So everything Stuart said about those connections with southern Manitoba are very true. So I talk about a day in the life. Some of the things that I do in a given day, it really varies, and it's never the same. Sometimes I have some language classes, and those are coming along fine. I was thinking at the end maybe Stuart could do some Icelandic speaking, because it's very impressive. We raise the flag at the residence and at the embassy every day. And then it's basically focusing on a few different key areas and then doing all the general things that embassies do. So my next slides will talk about kind of the things that we do at embassies. But I'll just say a few things of what I focus on. And I pick things based on Canada's priorities as well as where I see scope and opportunity in line with Iceland's priorities. And so what I focus on is obviously Iceland's role and influence as an Arctic state is a big one. And I also focus on, here we go, the climate innovation piece that I mentioned, because there's great opportunities for exchanging of knowledge between Canada and Iceland in that area. Security and defense is an interesting one, with certainly changing geopolitics in the world, and Iceland does not have a military, but they have an incredibly well-respected Coast Guard, and they also have a military base where NATO operations and exercises take place. And so they're a great partner for Canada and other NATO countries, including in the context of the current invasion of Ukraine, which I'll speak to. And then diversity and inclusion is another big piece for Canada. We always talk about diversity and inclusion, and we're trying to make a real effort in Iceland to talk about Canada and to talk about the lessons in what does it mean to welcome immigrant communities to our home. And so Iceland is welcoming more and more immigrant communities. There's a lot of Polish immigrants in Iceland. There are a lot of Afghans, Syrians, Venezuelans, and they're interested in learning from Canada's experience, so there's great opportunities there. Next slide. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to go through these quickly. This is just some public speaking slides. If people ask me, what do you need to be able to do to be an ambassador, I think public speaking, being able to just being able to get up and speak, I think, is an important one. I'm looking at Stuart thinking, because you do a lot of that, but public speaking is an important one, and it's a way not only to talk about Canada's priorities, but that's also an opportunity to mentor people, because I realized that how I really got into the line of work I did in Canadian studies was through Professor Simon's speaking. So I try to use opportunities wherever I can, whether it's here at the university, whether it's with students in Iceland, and years ago I went on ships with students on ice, and I love doing stuff like that where I can speak to people about Canada's priorities. Next one is, this is public diplomacy. This is a fun one. Public diplomacy is finding ways to do activities that sort of put a Canadian footprint on something. And like this one behind me, last year was the 75th anniversary of Iceland-Canada relations. And I decided that our embassy would gift to Iceland 75 Canadian book titles to the libraries. And we just kind of blew this up. We got really excited about it. We turned the books into 75. That's really exciting. And then we did a number of events at the library. We included the First Lady of Iceland, who was very enthusiastic. And then we really got carried away, and we thought, well, wait a second, why don't we also contribute to the university in the north a number of books about Indigenous law? Because Iceland does not have Indigenous people, but they're really interested in Indigenous issues and Indigenous law. So they were enthusiastic, and so I got some input, in that stack of books, on the other side, are some of the books that we donated to the library. And I've heard that the students were so excited. They were trying to read the books before we'd done the event, and they were telling me, don't worry, we didn't crack the binder open, we were just trying to read them. I thought, well, it's okay, you can use the books, it's fine. But So we do a lot of public diplomacy initiatives to advance our priorities. Next page. Oh yes, so the ground did shake for 30 days in a row. There were, I think, 30,000 earthquakes that were measurable the first March that I was there, and I arrived at the end of January. So I kind of wondered, what have I done? But then it eventually stopped, and then the volcano erupted, and then all the tourists started going to the volcano, and I just kept thinking, please don't let anyone get hurt. We do training with our staff. We have experts come in from other embassies, and we do emergency planning on scenarios. And this was a fun group. We all wear different vests to say, you know, who's the logistics person, who's comms, who's the lead coordinator. And the scenario that they don't tell you what the scenario is, but the scenario that they brought to us was a cruise ship incident with a number of high-level Canadian government officials on the cruise ship. And then I guess the cruise ship had hit a Canadian tanker in this scenario. And then because there was an oil spill, there were people demonstrating outside the embassy, and then they started a fire at the embassy. So partway through the scenario, we actually had to run out of the embassy because the embassy was on fire. So they try to make it really, they didn't actually set a fire, but they do these things because we're a small team. And so sure, if something happens in Iceland, they will send in surge capacity, but there's probably 24 hours where the 5 of us need to figure out what to do. So it's really good to communicate on what the options are and who to call and what the sequencing is. Next page. Representing Canada, that's a big one. Certainly Remembrance Day, I join others at the Commonwealth War Graves, and I talk or participate. That the last one we just happened to have a big crew of Canadians at the Reykjavik base, and so they asked if they could come to the event, which was really great. Next page. Defense and security. As I mentioned, there's a NATO base in Iceland, a lot of overflights, a lot of exercises. I meet the crew, the Canadian defense crew, when they come. I want to go to the next page, though, because I want to talk about this very briefly. There was an opportunity recently where Iceland decided to, because they don't have a military, they wanted to do something a bit different in support of Ukraine, and they decided to bring together volunteers from across Iceland and knit sweaters for Ukrainian soldiers. But they needed to find a way to get the gear, the sweaters. There was even a onesie. I guess it was families of soldiers too. But anyway, mitts and lots of warm clothes to Ukraine. And so they put out a call through NATO channels who could pick it up. And Canada responded to the call. And I think it was all decided on a Friday. And I got a call saying, can you be at the base on Monday to greet the plane? And so the plane arrives, and I thought there'd be a whole pile of Canadians, and there's 2 guys in there because they wanted to leave enough room for the sweaters. And they meet the foreign minister of Iceland, and they're having a chat. And they'd never been to Iceland before, but the Canadian says to the foreign minister of Iceland, oh, but I know an Icelander. And she says, oh, what's his name? And he says what his name is. And she's like, oh, no, he's a good friend of mine. So, but it was really, really very, very moving to be there with the volunteers. They're the volunteers that did some of the knitting and organized the group, and to see the plane leave with all the sweaters, and to just such a great concrete form of cooperation between Canada and Iceland in response to needs in Ukraine. And then diversity and inclusion, I thought I would just include a picture from the Pride Parade that occurs every year, and it's a very significant event in Iceland. And not all embassies are represented there, but certainly Canada makes sure we're there loud and clear. And we have this big flag, probably maybe Stuart got it when he was there, but we carry it down the street. And I think because of those historic connections, there's a bunch of diplomats there, and like-minded countries and everything, and everyone's just screaming out, Canada, Canada! So I just carry that huge flag everywhere, it's great. All right, back to having fun. So there's a few slides here that are basically Iceland, Northern Lights, as everyone knows. It's actual real pictures. It's pretty amazing. The hot pools that that heat the homes and power activities in Iceland. They also provide an incredible source of relaxation and exercise because people can do laps year-round outside, which is amazing, even in the snow. And then, of course, horses are very common in Iceland and beautiful. And that's me running a race around an island in the south of Iceland called the Puffin Run. And I think that's it. Where do I go next? Oh yeah, that's it. So this last slide is a picture of me after a very difficult 2 or 3 days along the east coast of Iceland back in 2003. And then that's me after about 3 days of hosting the Governor General in Iceland. I look more tired in that one, I think. So anyway, I guess I thought I'd done the last one because I've always loved Iceland, but I can't say that I was like, I'm going to come back here as ambassador. I've certainly knew I'd love to be posted here, but I never really had a path figured out of what I wanted to do. So I think that just having interests and passions and following those and being open to things and curious can lead you to interesting places, even though it might look like I had a real plan, but I really didn't. So I'll end there.
Great, thanks very much, Jeannette. That was a marvelous talk. And again, I will not use the moderator's prerogative and bombard you with the 8 questions I have written down here. Instead, thank you very much for agreeing to take questions, which I hope you have.
I will, yes.
Great. And would love to invite the audience if you have any questions. Wonderful, please, Julia.
So you ended up in Iceland, and I'm just wondering how the posting processes actually work. I mean, was there like on the Foreign Service, I think that's what it's called, no, Global Affairs, whatever it's called now. Is there like a website or something that comes up that we're looking for a new ambassador in Iceland and therefore Jeannette Menzies applies? Or how does this work?
God, Stuart, do you want to explain the process? So basically every year, every fall, a list comes out within the department and everyone eagerly awaits the list. Although usually you know what's going to be on it because you can do the math as to when someone arrived, when they'll leave. But then you open up the list and it tells you these are the positions opening up. And for the ambassador posts, you look at them and you apply to them and you submit your application, and your application includes sort of all the reasons why you have the skill set. It's very much focused on the skill set. If I were to say I run around the country and I really know it really well and I have some friends, it doesn't help. So I think it's really quite skills. It's like, do I have good judgment? Do I have good management? Will I manage the embassy and the finances and the team? And so it's those sorts of things that they look at. It's quite different from the process of applying to get into the department because that is, I guess, a longer process, but includes lots of different formalized interviews. And it's a little bit, I'd say it's less formal in some ways, but much more rigorous and a lot of unknowns because you sort of apply and then you don't really know where things are at, and it's a little bit of a black hole. And then you sometimes get a phone call and you're like, okay, this is where you may be going, except then you're not allowed to talk about it because it has to be approved by many levels. And anywhere along the way, someone could decide that someone else is going there. So for quite a while, I knew I was going there, but you don't really know until it becomes publicly announced by the Prime Minister, and that can take a number of months. Do you want to add to that, Stuart, or does that?
From here, from there?
Here.
Oh.
Stuart is more
I
experienced.
think it's great for the video if you want to.
Oh yeah, go to
sure.
the video. Yeah, go to the video. Yeah.
No, I think Jeannette covered it. It's true that it's very competency based for the ambassadors, but they are looking also at skill sets and experience. And I sit on something that's called the Assignment Advisory Council, and when Foreign Service officers under the level of ambassador apply for positions, there are often more people that apply for certain positions and less people that apply for other positions. And it's a bit of a Hunger Games, and the managers out there want the best people for their positions. But I don't know when you joined, but when I joined, there was a kind of unwritten rule that the year before you wanted to get posted, you should spend at least 20 minutes a day on your career networking and figuring out what that list was going to say. Because the moment the list comes out, you better know which of the ones that you're well suited for, who the decision maker is going to be for that. What managers have you worked for in the past that know that decision maker and that would be willing to do a cold call to recommend you, so that within early days of the horse trading that happens, the person who's making the decision hears from independent sources that there's this really great candidate out there named Jeannette, and they should make sure they look for them on the list, because otherwise you can go through CVs and you can go through competencies and stuff, but everyone's a talented foreign service officer. You wouldn't be there if you weren't. And then you look at language skills and past experience, but those kind of personal references mean a lot. For the ambassadorial appointments, it's a bit more of a black box or a black hole, because it goes all the way through until the Order in Council process, and it goes to Cabinet, and then the Governor General signs off, and so no one can talk about it because it's Cabinet secrecy until that happens. But strangely, and I don't know if you knew this, but we weren't, my partner Brian and I weren't supposed to go to Iceland. We were supposed to go to Turkey. But in fact, I got summoned to the Assistant Deputy Minister's office, and I kind of thought that the department, I was disappointed, because at that moment I'd been having a fight with personnel, because we wanted to go to Turkey. There were some lawyers in the department that felt that sending a gay couple to Turkey where one partner wouldn't have full diplomatic immunity was unacceptable from a legal perspective of the department. However, there were gay people at our mission in Ankara who the Turks were happy to find a workaround and make sure that they had the right visa and take care of them. So clearly the lawyers and the HR people hadn't actually spoken to the mission to figure out what's in the art of the possible. And I went up there thinking, okay, there's a time in the department where everything just became more legalistic and more HR folk. Everyone's trying to cover their butts, and so no one was going to stick their neck out for us. And I kind of thought, okay, now I'm going to be told by my mentor in the department, actually was ADM at the time, that no, sorry, Stuart, you don't get to go to Turkey. And so I sat down and I said, it's about Turkey, right? He said, well, you're not going to Turkey. And I was all getting ready to have this passionate fight about why we should go to Turkey. And he said, how'd you like to go as ambassador to Iceland? And that was it.
Just a couple of questions for either you, Jeannette, or both of us.
Would you use the mic?
I was interested about Gimli in terms of the Icelandic language, because it's so unique as far as a type of people who in North America. Have they kept up the language or bringing it back?
I would say you would perhaps hear it in the retirement home in Gimli a little
Really?
bit, but I don't think you'd
But
hear it in the
there's no
schools.
educational program.
No, I have
teach
met
it.
some young people who do speak it, and they come to Iceland as part of this Snorri program that gives opportunities for Canadians to visit Iceland, Canadians of Icelandic descent. And some of them speak some Icelandic, and I ask them, where on earth did you learn Icelandic? And it's from their grandma, their oma. They are not learning it in school. So it's passed down from family, but it's very rare to meet a young person from Gimli who speaks Icelandic.
This is to both of you, Stuart and Jeannette. We're aware that our diplomatic postings are much for a different level than they are in the States in terms of the political input. There are certain postings, for instance, large postings in the UK, for instance, which would have a strong political input to it. Is that about as far as it goes? I mean, when you're competing or you're looking at diplomatic postings around the world, how different are we to other countries?
That's a good question. I think.
Why ask that?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. Well, I think we're probably similar to maybe the Australians and the New Zealanders in terms of how we assign, possibly to the Brits. Possibly the Americans often have many political appointees. We have much fewer. And so different systems, different strengths. To me, I think it's in order to always have someone there, our system is set up so that there are rotations every few years, and there's not so many gaps where you have to wait for that political appointment. And I think that's a good thing, to have that coverage. For example, when you have 30,000 earthquakes in 30 days, it's nice to know that you have a full complement at the embassy. And but there's certainly different ways of doing it, and I think Canada is similar to many of our Commonwealth friends.
Awesome. We're going to go to an online question before we take anybody else's question from the crowd. I'm just going to read this off word for word. Jeannette, what part of your time at Trent, what you've learned and your experiences, are you able to apply in your job or your life in Iceland?
Two things. One is the critical thinking aspect and the sort of exploring issues. Like, I do not have anyone telling me this is what you need to research and learn about and study and follow. So I have to, I think, use the skills that I really honed in on at Trent to sort of see where there are either gaps in our knowledge or issues at play that are really of interest to Canada. So it's kind of up to me to be thinking critically and asking the right questions. And I'm not scared to ask questions. And so I think that's something that Trent helped me with, is to be able to ask those questions. And then the second thing I was going to say is my life at Trent was so busy. My God, I was so busy when I was here. Mm-hmm. And I loved it. Like, I was TAing, I was rowing, I was going out quite a lot, and I was writing my thesis, and I was trying to figure out what to do next and applying for jobs. And I really learned how to multitask and how to sort of know when is too much, and how to get, in an embassy, especially in Reykjavik, you're kind of doing everything. And so, you need to know, okay, I need to stop what I'm doing and fix that heating system before it starts a fire at the embassy, versus I need to go to that event. Like, there's so much going on. I have to decide often quickly, where do I need to focus my attention? And I think Trent helped me with that, just how to juggle a lot of things all at once and then know when I need to kind of stop and focus.
I'm interested in the question about advancing Canada's agenda, and I would have thought that there would be money aspects or money components to it. So I'm wondering, is there any economic component to your job apart from some portion of the 3 million tourists, any trade component or any other technology exchange or anything like that?
Absolutely. There is a focus. In fact, I have a position that is a trade position who focus on commercial relations and advancing that business-to-business partnership. I'd say there's a lot going on between Canada and Iceland around oceans, fisheries, technology, climate innovation, research cooperation. And we're trying to enhance that more, because Iceland naturally looks at the United States, but there's a lot they can do in the Canadian market. And I think there's a lot of interest from Canada in Iceland as well. So one thing I'll just point out is there's a really interesting, is it a spa in Iceland that's actually owned by a Canadian, the Sky Lagoon, and a Flyover Iceland initiative that started in Canada. So there's some big Canadian investments that went into Iceland that have, in some cases they've changed hands now, but there is a significant Canadian impact in Iceland, and the other way around too. And it also translates to cultural industries. A lot of interest in terms of music, theater, and that's also another way to advance priorities and share interests.
The reason I asked that question is because of the business that I used to be involved in, which was related to aquaculture, and Iceland figured very prominently as a source of salmon eggs. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of controversy, a lot of international law, a lot of environmental issues, and it was just extremely contentious then. I've sort of lost touch about it recently, but I know, I get the sense that aquaculture also has some contentious elements in Iceland, and yet globally it's just becoming such a dominant industry. I'm just curious if you can tell us what the latest is on that.
I don't have the latest on aquaculture, but tech is another area that I'll say where there's a lot of scope. And I just had lunch actually with the Icelandic ambassador the other day to Canada. His background is trade, and I asked him if you were to say one area where there's scope and potential that is sort of untapped, unharnessed, and he said it's in that tech area. So I think you'll see more and more of that trade relationship between Canada and Iceland.
Tech generally.
Yeah, generally, yeah.
So I have a question, I will jump in at this point. You referenced February of last year, Russia's completely unprovoked, brutal further invasion of Ukraine, the war that's ensued. I wonder if you can reflect a bit from an ambassadorial position of what that has meant in terms of the dynamic of relations amongst ambassadors in Reykjavik. I mean, I think it's pretty self-evident with the ceasing of diplomatic engagement with the Russians, what that looks like. But I wonder if you could share with us a bit of the insight on what that means for the like-minded Arctic states, or even within a NATO context, in a relatively tight community like the ambassadorial community in Reykjavik, what that has meant.
Yeah, and it's interesting in Reykjavik, there's like 15 foreign embassies in Reykjavik, so we're not a big group, and where the embassy is located, it's at a corner of a street. Neighbors across the street are the Indian embassy, and then next door is the Russian ambassador's residence, and across the street is the German embassy, where the German ambassador is married to a Russian citizen. And they have put a spotlight on their home, which is the colors of the Ukrainian flag, so that the Russian ambassador opens the windows and sees. So there's, I have not seen the Russian ambassador since the invasion, and I would have seen him at every diplomatic event, but he's not invited anymore, and I don't see him anywhere. So in that sense, I wouldn't say that, there's certainly, every single meeting I am at with other ambassadors, we talk about Russia, we talk about Ukraine, we talk about what we're all doing and how we can all work together, and we talk about what Iceland's doing, and we're all incredibly impressed with what Iceland is doing. Like, Iceland punches well above its weight and is making significant humanitarian contributions, making contributions in terms of military equipment and training, prosthetics. I talked about the sweaters, and then welcoming refugees. I think it's 2,000 so far, which is large for Iceland. And their foreign minister is incredibly outspoken and not holding back in any way. And the country is also completely in line with the EU in terms of sanctions. And that's a big deal for Iceland, because Iceland-Russia relations on fisheries, there's a lot of business there that's been halted. And so if they weren't in line with all those things, all of our other embassies would maybe be encouraging Iceland to step up. Iceland has stepped up. So it's all about solidarity. It's about finding opportunities and really giving profile where we can.
Hi, Jeanette. My name's Rosemary, and I thank you very much. It was very interesting. My international views were formed with CEDA. You remember CEDA?
I do.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And 3 years in Jamaica and 3 years in Tanzania. My question is, how closely do you stay in touch with Melanie Joly and Ottawa?
Oh gosh, well, I stay in touch with Ottawa daily. Is that the right answer, Stuart?
Oh, yes. I would have said more than once a day.
I stay very connected to Ottawa, and this is why studying Canada and being a proud defender of Canadian studies, to me, I realize in my job it's all about Canada. Like this, sure, I'm the ambassador in Iceland, but my job is to promote Canada, to know what's happening in Canada. Not only do I touch base with Ottawa regularly, I read our media service to make sure I know where Canada's been criticized and what is going on domestically. I make sure I keep up with the news in Canada. I talk with my parents often, and they tell me what I've missed and keep me up to speed. It's probably the most important part of the job, is to actually know what's going on in Canada. And to be able to speak, people ask me about all parts of Canada and all aspects of Canadian history. And so it's exciting, because I might not know everything, but I can always figure out where to find it out. So I'm constantly on this quest to know more. And it takes me back to the book, to know ourselves, right? Like, that's what it's kind of all about. So it's back to the question. I talk often with Ottawa. I do not talk with the minister. And that's because we go through the department in order to give advice to the minister. So there's a little bit of a process that goes through a number of different people in the department. Certainly I would speak to the minister if she were to arrive in Iceland. I would meet her at the airport, and I would accompany her to meetings. I did meet the last foreign minister, Minister Garneau, because he was at the Arctic Council meeting representing Canada. So I actually was fortunate to be able to sit in the meetings with him, with Foreign Minister Lavrov and with Secretary of State Blinken, just before the invasion. So those were pretty unique meetings to be part of.
Hi, I'm Spencer. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about your impression of diversity and inclusion there as compared to diversity and inclusion here. I've traveled there only 4 times so far, but I have a very specific sense as a gay man how unhomophobic Iceland is.
Mm-hmm.
Thoughts?
Oh God, I kind of feel like I have to ask Stuart to answer this question. That's the right thing to do, isn't it?
I will happy to say something, but you say first. 'Cause
Okay.
It's very interesting to see it through your eyes.
Okay, so I'm not a gay man. I don't know if that's obvious.
Gay men.
No. Okay, yeah.
Diversity, inclusion.
Okay, so in diversity inclusion, of course, it's broad, and like absolutely, I would say I certainly see women holding hands, men holding hands very, very publicly, and it's very. And here's an example. I went to an Arctic Council meeting. I showed up with a colleague from another department. We are both women. We were both checking in at the same time. The assumption was we were a lesbian couple, even though we were not actually a lesbian couple. We were checking in separately, but the assumption was that. So it's sort of, and again, this is why I want to turn to Stuart, because my sense is that it's very, very, very accepting, very open society. And where I think, in terms of diversity and inclusion, there's some learning the other way around is when it comes to welcoming of immigrants and populations that are not white, and I think that don't speak English perfectly. And I have felt very welcomed in Iceland. And would my experience be the same if I was of color? I don't know. Or indigenous? Possibly, but I don't know. And so, but I'm going to turn to Stuart because I want to give you a few minutes. You've also experienced that perspective.
Thanks, Jeannette, and thanks, Spencer. Iceland has progressed remarkably quickly, but it was only 10, 20, 30 years ago. Iceland was probably one of the more homophobic places in Europe. But the people that we met, Brian and I arrived in Iceland in October. I think we met at the local swimming pool, which is where you meet everybody in town. We met a couple, and one of the two, he's the head of political science, dean of political science at the university, and his husband is a radio and television personality. He's an author, he's an actor, he's a playwright. And they were very curious. New face in town. Are you just a tourist, or are you? We moved here all year. And it was their sense right away that we needed to meet everyone. So they just decided to host a reception or a party at their house. And the following week we were introduced to the gay mafia of Iceland, which was, the prosecutor general and the head of legal affairs at the foreign ministry, and some teachers and some actors, and it seemed so matter of fact. They each had been previously married. They both had kids. The kids, when they became of age, they left living with their mothers and moved to their fathers because they were more interesting. It was there was never a moment where we didn't feel accepted. The Pride parade that Jeannette had pictures of. So, country of 350,000 people, 380 now. 110,000 people come out to Pride. Yeah. That's a third of the country on one day, and it's as much families with prams and kids of all ages as it is die-hard militant activists. It's a celebration of the diversity of families. But very interestingly, Iceland is a small place, and what I hear from them is that they're a very reserved society in some ways, like other Nordic countries tend to be as well. But because they are so small, once the issue became politicized, once in the 70s or 80s people started coming out, it happened very quickly that people were able to identify that this isn't the other. This is my cousin, my neighbor, my friend, my family member. And so it was almost overnight that they went from being one of the most homophobic societies to one of the most welcoming societies. It's interesting. We when I first joined the Foreign Service, and one of my first posting to the United States. My own government didn't recognize my partner, my boyfriend at the time, and certainly the United States didn't, and we sort of had to fight for a visa, and over the years that's changed. But in the space of that one career, or my one career, we arrived in Iceland, where Brian and I were the first openly gay ambassadorial couple in Iceland, and I presented credentials to a government led by the planet's first lesbian prime minister. So that's kind of cool.
That's very cool.
But not too far away from Iceland is the Faroe Islands, which is actually part of the Danish kingdom, and they are much like Danish society, sort of like a little Icelandic society, and they're where Iceland was 20 years ago. There, it's hard to be out. If you're out in the Faroe Islands, you move to Copenhagen or you move to Iceland, but one expects that they too will change very quickly. But for diversity and inclusion, the big challenge is definitely immigration, and immigration of non-Europeans into Iceland, and they are welcoming, and they are certainly now with tourism, they're seeing more people, they're getting more comfortable with that, but for a small society, again, that's been closed and felt they'd had to take care of themselves for 1,000 years, that's a bit more difficult.
Great, thanks. One last question, Jeannette. Since arriving in Iceland, what has been the single biggest surprise or unexpected observation or myth that you've found you've had to dispel about your understandings of Iceland or notions of Iceland?
My answer is not very academic. I can't get it out of my head though, so I have to say it. And then maybe something more profound will come out. But the fact that ice cream stores are open all year round, all evening. Rain, shine, snow, storm. They do not close the ice cream stores in the winter. And they do not close them at like 4 p.m. Anyway, there's like an abundance of ice cream in Iceland. So that's one thing that surprised me. Ask another question and maybe something else profound will come to me.
Well, at this...
Is there a lot of cows in Iceland?
Gosh, I was looking for cows for a long time because I realized I hadn't seen any. So my husband and I were driving around going, where are the cows? And then we found them. They're in the south.
Okay.
And in the west as well. But yes, there are cows. Yeah, and Great Skier. Yeah. And then, here, I just thought of a good answer. What I didn't know that I know now is I went to one of these greenhouses and they're doing some interesting stuff. Oh, I'm looking at you nodding because it's probably a better answer than ice cream. But anyway, it's around food sustainability in northern climates. Iceland is doing some fascinating work around greenhouses, and I knew that they grew tomatoes because I get them at the grocery store and they're outstanding. But then I went to visit one and I realized they're not just growing beautiful tomatoes that taste like you want them to. They're growing bananas. They're growing bananas, and they're growing like figs, and they're growing like coffee beans. They're doing some amazing stuff, and they're doing it all year round with lighting and where they're placing of the vines, and it's pretty remarkable. So that is, I'm going to say that's the answer. And I keep wanting to write a paper about it and a little report about it because I think there's something interesting there. The whole bananas in Iceland thing is pretty shocking. It's been a bit mind-blowing.
On that note, I want to welcome Marilyn Burns, Vice President of Communications and Recruitment, to thank our speaker this evening.
Thank you so much, Heather, and thank you for inviting me tonight. This has been an amazing evening, all the way from driving through the driving snow to get to dinner to this moment in time. And I was writing and writing, and what I have is this swirling mass of connections. And what struck me is the extent to which you, Jeannette, and through Stuart and others, you have made this connection all the way from Trent, Iceland, which I think is the title of your talk, but it came out so strongly. The extent to which you have this openness and this deep intelligence that has allowed you to take advantage of so many different opportunities and to, frankly, represent us so beautifully as a Canadian overseas. It also struck me the name of the book that was maybe the spark for you to come to Trent, to know ourselves. And really, I think many of us feel that to know ourselves, we have to get away and get farther away, and that really does inform our sense of self. And one of your favorite people, Tom Simons, made the motto of this university, "Now I know in part." And I think that you're showing this discovery that is just an ongoing theme within your life. And when I look at who is here tonight in this room, it's almost like a who's who of the Canadian Studies world at Trent. I think Tom would have loved to have been here to see all of this happen. In our work in communications and enrollment, we're often trying to define the Trent experience. And one of the things that we come back to, certain terms and words that we try to make sure that we come back to make sure that we're on our quote unquote brand. And one of those is humbly brilliant. And it strikes me that you are the epitome of this humble, brilliant Trent grad, and we thank you for having joined us tonight.